So imagine it's 1949. The world's just emerged from the most catastrophic conflict in history. World War II left devastation, mistrust, and a fractured global order. And right there, in this chaotic post-war landscape, 12 nations, including the US, UK, Canada, and a handful of European countries came together to sign the North Atlantic Treaty. This wasn't just some ordinary alliance, it was an agreement with a bold principle: collective defence.
Right, and that principle was encapsulated perfectly in Article 5. It's such a simple yet powerful idea, isn't it? An attack on one member is treated as an attack on all. And with memories of the war still fresh, that solidarity could be the difference between peace and another global disaster. It's like a
safety net. You're exactly right. But it wasn't just about peacekeeping, you know. This treaty was a direct response to the Soviet Union's expanding sphere of influence. The Cold War was heating up, and these countries felt this looming threat, especially in Western Europe.
And you can absolutely understand why. I mean, even though the fighting had stopped, the geopolitical chessboard was primed for conflict. The nations that founded NATO knew they needed each other to face what seemed like an unstoppable communist bloc. It must have been a tense time, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Tense, but critical. What's fascinating is how this wasn't merely about military might. NATO represented shared values: democracy, freedom, the rule of law, all amplified during the Cold War. And gathering these nations under a single alliance created something larger than any one country could ever be alone.
Totally. And I love how it stemmed from such a deliberate effort to prevent history from repeating itself. After all, the Treaty of Dunkirk in 1947 and the Brussels Treaty in 1948 set the stage for NATO. Those agreements were like the rehearsal, weren't they?
That's right. Those earlier treaties were European attempts at security cooperation, but NATO brought in the superpowers, the United States and Canada, and that changed the game. It wasn't just regional anymore. Now it included North America, strengthening that transatlantic bond.
It's so forward-thinking when you stop and consider it. It even shaped how military planning happens. Like, did you know NATO established an integrated command structure from the start? Coordinating defence strategies among sovereign nations? It's genius, and it's still in place.
Indeed. And one could argue that this integration might have been its most significant innovation. Think about it. Countries like France, Italy, and even smaller nations like Luxembourg aligning their military frameworks with global superpowers. The sheer logistics of that, it's remarkable.
For sure. And what's more remarkable is how it actually worked. At the centre of it all was the idea that no single nation could or should stand alone. It's essentially saying, we've got each other's backs. It's almost heartwarming in a way.
Heartwarming but rooted in strategic necessity. Unity, especially in the face of adversity, often is. But what's particularly striking is how this unity didn't just remain defensive. Over time, NATO became a proactive force, adapting its mission to changing threats. But that story is for later.
Building on its bold beginnings, NATO didn't just stop at being a defensive alliance. During the Cold War, it rapidly evolved into a cornerstone of stability and security for the Western world. It wasn't only about soldiers or strategies. It was a declaration of shared strength and unity in an uncertain era.
And it had to be stronger together, didn't it? Because the Cold War brought with it some of the highest stakes in history. I mean, can you imagine living through the Berlin Wall going up in 1961?
Yes, the Berlin Wall. Such a symbol of division. It wasn't just concrete or barbed wire. It represented an ideological rift across Europe. And for NATO, it underscored the importance of protecting its members from potential Soviet aggression.
The stakes were so high. You've got the world split into East and West, nuclear weapons looming as this constant threat. NATO was absolutely critical during those decades. But then, fast forward to 1990, the wall comes down, Germany reunifies, and NATO's role begins to shift, doesn't it?
It does indeed. The reunification of Germany marked a turning point. the Cold War was over and NATO was suddenly asking itself, what now? Less about fearing the Soviet Union and more about managing security in a rapidly changing world.
Right. And that's where post-Cold War operations come in. Countries in turmoil, like in the Balkans, NATO gets involved. This wasn't just defence anymore. It was also humanitarian intervention, bringing stability after conflict.
Exactly. Take Bosnia in the 1990s as a prime example. NATO enforced a no-fly zone and launched Operation Deliberate Force to stop the violence during the Bosnian War. It was a big deal, a clear shift toward proactive missions.
And don't forget Kosovo too. The intervention there was huge, a bombing campaign to, basically, protect civilians in the late 90s. NATO showed it wasn't afraid to adapt for the sake of peace in new contexts.
Absolutely. Then came the war on terror. Post 9/11, NATO invoked Article 5 for the first and only time, leading to operations in Afghanistan. That marked another big shift. The alliance started operating beyond its traditional boundaries.
And today NATO keeps evolving. Russia's actions, like the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the war in Ukraine, have reinvigorated NATO's mission. But let's also talk about Sweden. They joined NATO just last March 2024.
Yes, Sweden's accession is monumental. It's the latest chapter in NATO's expansion story. This move reinforces NATO's focus on Eastern Europe, especially as tensions with Russia continue. It's strategic, to say the least.
Strategic and symbolic. Sweden joining sends a message. The alliance is as relevant as ever in a world where deterrence is so incredibly vital.
Vital and timely given the global landscape. But NATO's mission doesn't end with expansion or old battles. It's continually reshaping its capabilities to stay prepared for whatever comes next.
Speaking of NATO's evolution and its continued relevance, let's focus on where it stands today. It's incredible to see how far it has come since 1949. With a collective defence force of around 3.5 million personnel, it's no exaggeration to say NATO has grown into a powerhouse, almost matching the population of a small country.
Wow, that's massive. And that kind of manpower doesn't come cheap, does it? I've read that defence spending has surged, especially after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. NATO members are really stepping up their commitments, right?
Exactly. Member states have agreed to a target of 2% of their GDP for defence spending by 2024, and some have even exceeded it. This renewed focus is a response to modern threats like cyber warfare, hybrid tactics, and of course, Russian aggression in Eastern Europe. It's not just about tanks and soldiers anymore. It's an all-encompassing strategy.
Right, and it's not just about existing members either. What about countries like Ukraine and Georgia? NATO supports them too, doesn't it?
It does. NATO has a programme of partnerships, including aspiring members like Ukraine and Georgia. It provides military support, policy advice, and training. These partnerships don't just strengthen those countries, they bolster the alliance itself. But full membership, that's a much more complex process, especially when you consider the geopolitical implications.
Oh, definitely. I mean, inviting Ukraine to join NATO would be like poking the proverbial bear, wouldn't it? Russia already sees NATO's expansion as a threat.
True. Any expansion near Russia's borders is bound to cause friction. But NATO operates under the principle that sovereign nations have the right to decide their alliances. At the same time, it's a delicate balance, supporting those who seek protection without escalating tensions unnecessarily.
And isn't it fascinating how NATO works with non-member countries through programs like the Partnership for Peace? That's been such a vital tool for fostering international relationships, hasn't it?
It really has. The Partnership for Peace programme has brought in countries that might not align with NATO's traditional framework, but still share common interests in stability and security. It's especially crucial as global threats become more interconnected. NATO isn't just preparing for the next cyber attack or military conflict. It's actively preventing them by strengthening ties worldwide.
It's like building a safety net that spans continents, isn't it? And with new challenges like climate-related conflicts popping up, that kind of cooperation feels even more necessary.
Absolutely. NATO today is as much about adaptability as it is about defence. It reflects the changing dynamics of the world, whether it's fighting terrorism, managing regional conflicts, or addressing emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and autonomous systems.
It's all so forward-thinking and, honestly, inspiring. NATO's more than just a military alliance. It's a testament to how countries can come together to tackle shared challenges.
Exactly. It's collective strength, built on shared values and mutual trust. And as the world changes, NATO will undoubtedly continue to evolve, ready to face whatever comes next.
And that's all for today. What a journey NATO has had, from its post-war beginnings to becoming a crucial player in global security. Thanks for tuning in, and we can't wait to explore another topic with you next time.
Until then, stay informed, stay curious, and we'll catch you in the next episode.